because I was doing IT stuff. So welcome today to the very small webinar, The Difference Between Identity and Lived Experiences. Thank you for coming. Firstly, I want to respectfully acknowledge that I stand on what always was and always will be Indigenous land. I'm here in a place that is commonly known as Melbourne, but before that was understood and known as Naarm, on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging, and unreservedly apologise for and express my shame over the dispossession, marginalisation, and attempted genocide of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I thank the traditional custodians of this land for continuing to allow me to work, play, campaign, and conduct my activities here. The objectives for today's little webinar is to really understand what is lived experience. We hear it, it's been talked about for a very long time now, for decades actually, in the local human services, health, development space within Australia. It is starting to be talked about as we continue to talk about these things like participation, inclusion, locally led, etc., in the international development and humanitarian space. So what is it when we say and we talk about lived experience? What is the difference between lived experience and identity? And how can we utilize lived experience for our projects and programs? If you have any questions to share, as I share my expertise and experience, I was trying to be a little bit funny there. Feel free to put your questions in the chat box, or we'll have 15 minutes at the end where you can ask any questions and have a bit of a discussion. A little bit about me. My name's Lana Woolf. I am an advisor, social inclusion, gender, disability, SOGIESC advisor. I work globally. I do a lot of little bits of training and so forth. And I work pretty exclusively in the international development and humanitarian space, as well as a little bit in the local space as well. So what is lived experience? Does anyone want to have a bit of a try and put in the chat box what they think lived experience is and what we mean when we say lived experience in relation to working in international development and humanitarian contexts? What is lived experience? If we kind of start off with the very basics and go to the dictionary, experience is the fact or state of having been affected by or gained knowledge through direct observation and participation. Practical knowledge, skills, or practice derived from direct observation or of participation in events or in a particular activity. So it's really about having gained knowledge through direct observation, participation, through our experiences. And I guess this starts to help us understand when there's a bit of a dichotomy between what lived experience is and what other types of experiences are. The term lived experience can be traced back to the second sex by the French writer Simone de Beauvoir in her seminal work, The Second Sex. De Beauvoir argued that the answer to the question, what is a woman, one had to dig beyond mere biological characteristics. And I used that, and I think that's really pertinent when we think about this and we think about where we are in our current challenges at the moment around what's called the culture wars, and for example, trans women, and how can we create a program when we're saying, well, this is a program focused on women, which women? So people with lived experience are those directly affected by experiences accessing or attempting to access things like health services, shelter, food, security, education, and other related projects, programs, or services directly connected with, in this case, humanitarian and international development sectors. This can include all people who are usually categorized as belonging to a vulnerable group. And so that includes women, people with disabilities, people with diverse sexual orientations, gender expressions, and sex characteristics, just to name a few groups. They're the groups that I predominantly work with, but there are other groups as well. It could be Indigenous folks, for example, or it could be refugees, so on and so forth. So it's about being directly affected by the experiences of either accessing something that we create or attempting to access that. When we say lived experience, we mean knowledge based on someone's perspective, personal identities, experiences, and histories beyond their professional or educational experience. This is an important distinction because rights holder organisations, civil society, CSOs, organisations of people with disabilities, DPOs, may not have all types of experiences and insights that can inform and improve systems, research, policy practices, and programs. And what I mean by that is that so often when I'm working on a project, and say, for example, I work in very participatory ways, so I want to co-design the project to ensure that it meets the needs, the rights, the accessibility, and the priorities of the community that I'm working in. CSOs might not necessarily have the knowledge about what those rights, what those needs are, what the priorities are of a local community, because they could be geographically very different. CSOs are often in big cities or capital cities. If you're working in community groups that are in regional, rural, or remote areas. Or, for example, some work I'm doing at the moment with an INGO in Uganda and in Mozambique is around disability inclusion. And I have been working and engaging in the local DPOs to develop training. And those local DPOs are awesome, but they don't represent or know or understand the needs and the experiences of people who have intellectual disabilities, the needs or experiences of people that experience mental illness, and so forth. So they're an awesome DPO, but they don't necessarily represent all people with disabilities or understand the needs of all people with disabilities. The same thing with civil society organisations that focus on what we typically call LGBTIQ+. Many of the CSOs have been created out of the AIDS epidemic. Most of their funding as a CSO has been from AIDS and health-related funding, and therefore some CSOs are more likely to be representing the needs and the rights of people who we would call key populations, predominantly gay men and trans women. And so although they might say we're an LGBTIQ+ CSO, they might not know or understand what it means to be a lesbian or a bisexual woman or someone who is intersex or someone that has identifies as asexual, for example. And so rights holder organizations are incredibly important. However, they don't necessarily know what someone's perspective, personal identities, experiences, and histories are outside of their own very distinct group, particularly if they are more advocacy-based as well and less community engagement-based. So what's the difference between lived experience and identity? Does anybody want to have an idea? Does anyone want to try and answer that? Whether it's in chat or to share and unmute your mic. No? Well, Victoria says perhaps the experiences have to do with things that you experience. Yeah. So all people have several intersecting identities, such as gender identity, ability, and race. Intersections of different identities lead to advantageous or disadvantageous experiences. It's not necessarily binary, but let's keep it that simple right now. And so, for example, someone might identify as a woman and be able-bodied and be Fijian. Someone might identify as a man, be neurodiverse and identify as Indian. And these different intersections, as we know, and I'm sure that you know, lead to different advantageous or disadvantageous experiences. And we need to think about that in relation to what it means to be able to access our programs and projects. Identity is a really complex and debated term. And I think it's really interesting because we don't talk enough about what identity is. When we're thinking about identity or when we're reading about it in the newspaper, often we're hearing and reading about identity politics of race and gender and sexuality. Questions of identity mark numerous arguments on gender, sexuality, nationality, ethnicity, and culture. You know, we're having what's called the gender wars at the moment. Who gets to define themselves as a woman? You know, nationality, questions of identity and nationality and ethnicity are causing wars. You know, culture, thinking about, well, who is Australian, who is not Australian, and identity around being Indigenous or non-Indigenous, being a settler, etc., etc. Identity plays a central role on nationalism and ethnic conflict, as I was talking about. You know, Myanmar is pretty close by, for example. And the idea of state identity is really important around the analysis of state sovereignty. Our job, I don't think, is so much to critique who identifies and who doesn't identify. Our job is to ensure that nobody's left behind, to use the 2030 catchphrase. And therefore, I really focus on self-identification. How does somebody self-identify? And you might hear that term a little bit on, you know, those that self-identify as women, those that self-identify as having a diverse sexuality, those who self-identify as people of color. You know, I think that's a perfect one. They have my mother's Scottish, my father's Fijian. I identify as a person of color. My children have me as their mother, and their other biological parent is First Nations Australian with a whole variety of background. And two of my kids identify as Indigenous and one doesn't. It's, you know, it's about how you see yourself. Sociology would say how you self-identify and how others identify you, but we know it's not really quite that simple. So without going down that rabbit hole too much, perspectives, what we really want to know is how someone identifies and what their lived experience is, and how that creates specific knowledge for us. So perspectives on the same issues varies with a person's identity and unique lived experience. For example, the experiences of attempting to access emergency shelter in a humanitarian disaster will be different for a trans woman and a lesbian woman. We know this because, we've done a little bit of research, but emergency shelters are usually designated in either family setting. This is when, there's no shelter. And so they have family tents. That family is very heteronormative, cisgendered. We know rapid needs assessments use binary sex categories, and therefore trans women would be, if they're not turning up in a heterosexual family unit, be identified as male, be put in sex segregated shelters with trans men. Lesbian women their relationships would not be recognised. They would be put in sex segregated shelters for other women, not necessarily with their partner if they have one. And so those experiences would be experiences that are really important for us to learn from so that we can do better, but they would be different experiences. Same with being able to access social protection, the difference between someone who lives, say, for example, in Jakarta and somebody that lives in Makassar. Or the experience of a young person with a mental illness and the experience of a young person who is a wheelchair user, both might be categorized as people with disabilities. They might self-identify as, well, I have a disability. However, their experience in accessing a youth leadership project could be very, very different. And so it's when those things come together. People live their daily lives in the context of larger social structures and systems. So even though they have personal agency and choice, they don't always have control over the barriers or constraints that these structures and systems often impose. And that's very much the case for both the humanitarian and international development systems. And we do leave people behind. We do not do a good enough job ensuring that particularly people with disabilities, particularly people with diverse sexualities and genders are included. In fact, they're often excluded. They're excluded because of things that are systemic and institutional, because of things like policies, as well as because of more kind of invisible things that we don't really think about or consider, like because of the history of exclusion and discrimination, people will now self-exclude. And so that's why this is such an important area of work, and why lived experience is really important experience, a really important expertise to have when we're designing, when we're researching, when we're implementing, when we're evaluating. And this is why we need to continue to ask questions. When we say women, which women are we talking about? When we say people with disabilities, which people with disabilities? Which types of lived experiences, which types of people with which kinds of identities are included, and what can we learn from everyone, including those that are not included? So humanitarian and international development programs, policies, strategies, and research can have a wide range of effect on individuals and communities. These effects can increase or undermine opportunities for inclusion. So we can ask ourselves, how can we benefit? How can we learn from people who participate in or are eligible to participate in our programs and projects, policies, and research? And so, this includes people who are currently accessing culturally, physically, financially, and geographically attainable projects that respond to their needs. Those participating in programs but not benefiting in the same way as others. Those that are eligible for but do not or cannot access our projects and programs. And again, for example, that might be, well, this is a project for women, but we're not including women with disabilities. We're not including trans women. We're not including lesbian women, for example. And those not currently eligible, but could really benefit from our projects. So how does engaging people with lived experience advance equality and social inclusion? I'll look at that shortly, Sonali, that question that you asked, and respond to that. It's important for humanitarian and development programs to value the perspectives of people they aim to support who could benefit from the programs or services by learning from and acting on their perspectives, histories, preferences, and aspirations. And it ensures that you do not leave behind people with shared identities in a particular context. Sonali says, so interesting, Lana. I'd be really keen to hear about how to be mindful of exploitation in the guise of engagement for persons with lived experience, if this makes sense. This might be something that you speak to later on, though, and it will be something that I'll speak later on now that you've asked that question. I haven't addressed it so much. So when we're talking about, well, how does this help us? It helps us, first of all, it's about helping with mindset and really thinking about the way that we view the world is different to what we've been led to believe. This is from Kellyanne McKirsch's Beyond Sticky Notes, and it's really changing your mindset around, well, what is expertise for a start? How do we engage in participatory ways? How do we think or move towards locally led? How do we think about strengths-based approaches? Like, we actually have all of these words. We have all of these frameworks. We put it in writing in our policies and in our project proposals and all sorts of things. But we need to think about, well, what does this look like in action? This is something that I use when I'm evaluating projects, when I'm evaluating policies and things. And I thought it was really interesting to share with you, because if we're not including people, if we're not taking an approach of really figuring out what the needs are of people, what their priorities are, if we're making deliberate choices not to understand or know these things, we actually doing harm. We probably don't know it because we haven't looked into it, but I guess a lot of the research that I've done shows that if you do not include people with diverse OGS, except in very extenuating circumstances, you're actually doing incredible harm to the community, because you're reinforcing with the power that you have that this group can and should be excluded and discriminated against. And it shows there's more emerging research showing that the community then reinforces their discrimination and exclusion, because see, those globally north, big fancy INGOs do it. And so it must be the right thing to do. And so it actually does harm to not include people. And that's really, that professional as expert. And professional as expert says things like, well, we've done all of this amazing desk-based research. We're experts in what we do. And this is why we have this very expert rapid needs assessment that actually is gender binary, doesn't acknowledge the difference between sex and gender. You know, it might have disability as a category without thinking about the Washington Group questions and what needs people might actually have, et cetera, et cetera. You know, person-centered is a term that was thrown around a bit for a while, but it actually doesn't think about the whole community. And when we're working in the majority world, it's actually really important to think about the whole community. Participatory approaches are actually meeting minimum requirements, but it's very reactive. Sometimes that's where you're at, and I do a lot of participatory approach stuff, but often it's still engaging lots and lots of people and lots of groups that might not be transforming social norms, etc. And then to the far end, when we think about transformative, which is another term that's kind of used a lot, it's actually when we get to the co-design, co-production, and then locally led space. And so really you can see here that alongside participation, alongside really knowing and understanding what people's lived experiences are and the barriers and they face and the priorities they have, and how much alongside that is how much power they have. So kind of what can we do? What use is it? What's happening here is really to bring into the fold lived experience as a type of really important experience that sits alongside, in participatory ways, other types of technical experiences, like, for example, water, sanitation and hygiene, or creating and building shelter, and all sorts of really big, important things, is really striving for true partnerships and really thinking about partnerships as being more than partnerships or formal MOUs with CSOs and DPOs and rights holder groups, but also with the community as well, and with people with particular types of lived experiences, as I said, the type of lived experience of, you know, attempting to access water when, you know, you live in a village that is, as a single mother, where there's no pipes, there's no flushing toilets, whatever it is. From there, being able to have true kind of relationships, building enough trust and so forth, so that you can genuinely, people with lived experience can help collaboratively make decisions about programs, research approaches, policies, etc., because those that are most affected by the interventions have the most to gain, and can really help us to see where our gaps are and what we need to do differently to ensure that they're not left behind. And from that, we can improve equitable outcomes for those whose communities we're meant to be there rejuvenating and whose needs we're meant to be meeting. They're in the local space. A lot of this has come out of the mental health space. I worked in mental health. I worked for peak bodies and governments, Australian state governments, 15 years ago and earlier. Part of deinstitutionalization and lived experience was something that, as a social inclusion specialist, I was very much a part of. And there was a difference between lived experience, somebody's lived experience, and the capital lived experience, in where we were developing designated roles, workforce issues. I did the policy for Australia's first completely consumer operated service. And so lived experience in capital letters is a title, is a role, rather than lived experience of someone's experience. And that's something to kind of be aware of when we're thinking about I guess as Sonali said, if we're truly seeing the expertise as something that is equal to ours, because not only is their lived experience, but it's feeding into how we can change, design, implement, evaluate in ways that are really moving towards that locally led. Then they would have a professional role. They would have, you know, a paycheck. They would be compensated as a worker with a particular expertise. Is that answering your question, Sonali? And does anyone have any other questions? That answers the question. Thanks, Sonali. So any other questions? Georgia.
Hi, Lana. Thanks so much for this. This is such a fantastic, just resource and information that you're providing for people to be able to tap into. So I'm really, really grateful as someone that also works in a GEDSI advisory space to just have this opportunity to learn from you. I was wondering, do you have, from your incredible experience, an example of where you've seen what you've been talking about done really well and what the sort of keys to that being done really well were?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure. I can obviously it's really easy to talk to some of my own work. And you can find on the website a toolkit I developed called Voices at the Table, which was participatory action research, where I used people's lived experiences so that they could co-design, co-implement, and so forth. And I guess to share a little story about that and how important lived experience was that this is in the Water for Women project. I was working in Eastern Indonesia. I was working with 6 participatory action research groups, but one that I'll share is the women in Manggarai. And so I went there. I spent about a month working with different groups, inviting them to come along to workshops and things to understand the difference between water, sanitation, and hygiene, to share about the project, to get to know me, to do kinds of activities, to see if they would like to participate genuinely. And we did that. This group of women ended up as one group. And so we did all of these interactive exercises, like I turned the gender clock into a water clock and made these cards on the difference of water, sanitation, hygiene, and all of these things, acknowledging that they had limited education. Some of them were illiterate, all of these challenges. So we made it really fun and used a lot of activities. And at the end of this month, I was like, okay, so what do you want to focus on in this project? You get to decide. It has to be water, sanitation, and hygiene, but what it is you want to focus on. And they said, and I had done all of this research and all this desk research, and I knew in dry season that there was no water. I knew that they didn't have water tank to their houses. They had to buy all of their water. They were very, very poor. So I assumed that they would want to talk about water, that water security was something that they were focused on. However, I did all of these activities and things because I was genuine in my approach. And so I wanted them to come up with the topic that they wanted to work on for the next couple of years. And they said sanitation. And I was very surprised because I thought water has to be the most pressing issue. But I was like, fine, that's great, you've chosen, but why have you chosen? And they've said, well, in rainy season, um, lots and lots of water, they have open drains, there's rubbish everywhere, they don't have sanitation service, the rubbish kind of gets washed into the drains, it ends up blocking the drains, the water fills up, the kids play in the water because, open drains, water, kids, mosquitoes come, the kids get sick with malaria, water and rubbish washes all over roads and creates mini floods. And then it builds up so much that it actually pushes all the rubbish out onto the rice paddy fields. And it kills the fish that they grow for protein. The rice doesn't grow. And instead of selling it, sometimes they're having to buy more just to feed their families. And so, although they have to buy water, this actually costs them in so many more ways, of health, of access, of food security, of all sorts of ways. And so I guess that's an example of using lived experience. In terms of paying people, we do pay everyone that participates in them. It's a really tricky thing. And so this is why I guess there is things like particular roles like developing PDs or about developing accountability mechanisms around, if you're going to participate, we're going to pay you, but this is the responsibilities and the expectations of everyone. And also do it for yourself as well. Do it for the whole team, not to other or out anyone else. But and so that it becomes a shared experience and a more collaborative experience. Georgia, was that useful? Was that helpful?
Yeah, thanks so much, Lana, for sharing that. That's a really interesting experience. Yeah, so appreciate it.
Victoria writes, do you have any tips or recommendations on the best way to capture if you're working with people with disability? One of the partners we shared how they would hold activities, workshops, etc. People are reluctant to self-identify as people with disabilities. I've spoken to them about using the Washington Group questions for their monitoring, but was wondering if you have any other additional recommendations. I guess I absolutely understand that point of view of reluctant to self-identify as people with disabilities because there's so much discrimination and stigma. Why would you want to, self-identify in a way that will increase potentially that discrimination and stigma? I guess the question is, why would you have to identify as people with disabilities? I know that there's lots of workshop sheets and all sorts of things that there's this tick box, because then, in reporting you can say, oh, I've worked with this many people with disabilities and so forth. But I guess I often push back on that because I know data collection is really useful, but really collecting data around, well, what needs do you have that we can accommodate so that you can actively participate? So that Washington Group questions around, that simple set, I think it's 6 or 8 Washington Group questions, really identifies needs. And if everybody has to identify needs, then you're not outing people with disabilities so much. And you're normalizing that there are a variety of needs. And also you're more likely to mainstream your projects. And I think that too easily we go into this idea that we just take a targeted approach as our first step, whether it's for women, people with disabilities, people with diverse OGS. And I think that unless it's very exceptional circumstances, first step is always to mainstream. Then if there's an issue and there's a reason why a particular group can't be mainstreamed, then you go into taking a targeted approach. So I would continue on talking about it in terms of creating safe, accessible, and inclusive spaces rather than spaces for people with disabilities. And you might find a little bit of stuff on the website about that. Is that helpful, Victoria?
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. Really appreciate that support.
Yeah. So any other questions? No, well, I hope that you've found it really useful. Please do head to the website and sign up to the newsletter. Watch the previous Unplugged webinars. We actually only have one more Unplugged webinar, which is looking at the preconditions to disability inclusion, is the next one. And after that, there's a whole new series which supports, is about having conversations with people. The first one is with someone from Blue Diamond Society in Nepal and someone from Urgent Action Fund in Asia Pacific about locally led approaches and what does that look like from different perspectives. So sign up to the newsletter and you will get all of the information. And thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Oh, I did it wrong. Stop recording.